A bitter wind howls through the mountains as the storm descends. A lone prospector, determined to survive, digs deep into the earth, carving out a refuge from the deadly cold. In the heart of winter's fury, one decision could mean life or death. The whiteout of '58 was coming, and he was the only one prepared. Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of survival, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The storm came without warning, a sudden shift in the wind that turned the world from gray to white. Thomas Gaines had been out in the mountains long enough to recognize the signs, but nothing in his 7 years of trapping had prepared him for this kind of storm. The snow, thick and blinding, came in swirling waves, covering the earth like a thick blanket. His cabin, a humble shelter of logs, built with his own 2 hands, would never withstand the fury of the whiteout. There was only one choice. The cold gnawed at his bones, sharp and relentless. He'd been digging for hours, carving into the snow and frozen earth, his hands raw from the cold, his breath coming in short, quick bursts. The tunnel was crude, a last-ditch effort to survive. But as he shoveled away the snow, he felt a glimmer of hope the tunnel could be his salvation. This was no ordinary man. Gaines was a seasoned prospector, older than most men who ventured into the wilderness, his face lined with the harsh realities of life in the Rockies. His beard, thick and unkempt, was streaked with the dirt of his survival. His coat, worn and patched, was no match for the deep chill that cut through the air. But he moved with a certain calm, a quiet resilience that only came from years of knowing how quickly the mountain could turn against you. The mountain had already claimed 3 men in his time, one frozen to death 20 feet from the fire, another crushed by a fallen tree, a third lost in the blinding snow, never seen again. Thomas had learned from their mistakes. He'd learned that surviving in the wild wasn't about brute strength or luck. It was about preparation, about knowing when to trust the land and when to hide from it. He'd been digging for days, with only his own determination to drive him forward. The heat tunnel, as he had begun to call it, was a simple structure. It wasn't a cabin, not a shelter in the traditional sense, but in the face of the blinding storm, it was the best he could do. As he carved deeper into the snow, he could feel the storm gaining strength. The wind howled louder and the temperature dropped further, but he kept digging. There was no turning back now. If he could just make it through this, he'd live to see another season, another spring. The wind picked up, roaring down from the peaks, as if the mountain itself was waking in anger. Thomas stood at the mouth of the tunnel, shoveling the last of the snow from the entrance. The snowstorm was only just beginning, but it was already becoming clear that it was unlike anything he had seen before. The sky had turned to an almost unnatural shade of gray, heavy with the weight of the coming blizzard. Thomas stood in the silence before the storm hit, the air still, almost eerily calm. His breath clouded in front of him, each exhale a visible reminder of the freezing cold. His fingers, numb and stiff from hours of work, gripped the shovel with determination. The shovel had become an extension of him, an essential tool for survival. He paused for a moment, his gaze flickering to the log cabin he had built with his own hands just a year earlier. The cabin, sturdy as it was, wouldn't be enough, not against a storm of this magnitude. The walls, thick with logs and chinked with moss, had been built to withstand the fierce winds of the Rockies, but they wouldn't stand up to the kind of cold that cut through flesh like a knife. The thought of the cabin being swallowed by the storm tightened his chest. It was a reminder that even the strongest shelters could be rendered useless in an instant. He had learned that lesson the hard way. It wasn't the mountain that killed you, but the weather, the elements you couldn't control. Turning away from the cabin, he returned to his tunnel, taking a final look at his progress. It wasn't much, but it was something. He was banking on the heat from his fire and the insulation of the earth to protect him from the worst of the storm. As the first gusts of snow whipped through the air, he crawled into the tunnel, pulling the shovel inside with him. The cold was already unbearable, but Thomas knew that the worst was yet to come. The storm would be relentless, a beast without mercy. It was a fight for survival, and the mountain would not make it easy. But Thomas had no choice. The tunnel was all he had. It was either this or the storm. As the snow began to pile up, Outside, he lit the fire in the small stone pit he had dug within the tunnel. The warmth it provided was fleeting, but it was enough to buy him time. Time to wait out the storm, time to hold on. He couldn't afford to lose it. Not now. Outside, the wind howled louder and the snow fell faster. The mountain was alive with the storm's fury, but Thomas was ready. He had fought this battle before, and he would fight it again. The fire in the pit crackled faintly, its warmth barely noticeable against the overwhelming cold. Thomas huddled near the stone fireplace, his thick fur coat and gloves offering little protection from the biting frost that crept in through every crack in the earth. The tunnel, which had promised refuge, now felt too small, too fragile to contain him. Outside, the storm raged with fury, but it was the relentless cold inside the tunnel that gnawed at him most. He had hoped the fire would be enough, that the natural insulation of the earth would create a barrier between him and the storm. But the temperature inside the tunnel had dropped with each passing hour. Thomas wrapped his arms tighter around his body, trying to preserve the last bits of warmth in his bones. His breath was shallow, coming in soft, foggy bursts, and each exhale felt like a battle. There was no question now the storm was a force unlike any other he had faced. The snow had piled up quickly, the entrance to his tunnel buried in a matter of hours. The wind outside howled like a pack of wolves, vicious and wild, clawing at the earth with violent gusts. His hands, now numb, shook as he rubbed them together, trying in vain to generate heat. The fire, small as it was, offered fleeting moments of comfort, but not enough to truly thaw him. He had prepared for this. He had spent years in the wilderness, learning its secrets, understanding how it worked. But nothing had prepared him for the feeling of being swallowed by the cold, of being trapped in a tiny space, the storm, outside, pressing in on him from all sides. He thought about the last time he had faced a similar storm, how he had barely survived, barely escaped with his life. That had been a winter of reckoning. He had lost friends that season, men who had been just as skilled, just as strong as he was, but who had been caught unprepared. One man, Hank, had frozen to death just 20 feet from the warmth of his fire. He had been close to safety, close to warmth, but the cold had consumed him in a way that no man could fight. That memory haunted Thomas, and now, in the heart of this storm, it seemed as though that same fate was closing in on him. The fire sputtered and crackled, the last of its embers fading. For a moment, Thomas sat in the dark, the cold creeping ever closer. The wind outside intensified, and the walls of the tunnel seemed to shrink with every gust. Thomas felt the weight of the storm pressing down on him, and for the first time in years, he was afraid. Afraid that his will might not be enough, that the wilderness would claim him as it had claimed so many others. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. He had to survive. For the sake of his own life, for the lives of those who might follow after him, he had to make it through. The storm outside might have been the worst he had ever seen, but it was far from over. And neither was he. The hours dragged on in the tunnel, time slipping by with little distinction. Each moment blurred into the next, filled with nothing but the constant gnawing presence of the storm outside. Snow had piled up over the entrance, and the wind continued to scream its fury into the mountain night. Thomas had long since given up trying to sleep. His body ached from the cold, and his mind, sharp as ever, raced with thoughts of survival. The fire had gone out hours ago, and now the tunnel was colder than ever. He had managed to salvage some of the logs and firewood from his pack, but they were running low. His thoughts were consumed, with one question: how long could he last? The storm had already proven to be much worse than he had anticipated, and with no way of knowing when it would end, he was left to his own devices. He couldn't afford to sit still, not in this situation. He had to keep moving, keep thinking, keep doing something. The cold didn't just freeze your body, it froze your mind as well. If he didn't stay sharp, if he allowed the cold to take root in his thoughts, he would fall victim to it just like the others. Thomas crawled to the far end of the tunnel, where his meager supplies lay scattered. He'd prepared for this, he thought, but nothing could truly prepare a man for the kind of cold that felt like it could swallow you whole. He pulled out a small stash of dried meat, gnawing on a piece to stave off the hunger that was beginning to gnaw at his insides. The warmth of the meat in his stomach was a brief comfort, but it did little to stave off the chill creeping deeper into his limbs. The hours passed in silence, save for the wind and the occasional scraping of snow against the tunnel's walls. Thomas had long ago given up trying to dig his way out. The snow outside was deep, and every attempt to clear the entrance was met with more snow piling in behind him. It was futile, and he knew it. He was trapped in this hole, a mere speck against the vast wilderness that surrounded him. His thoughts turned to the men he had lost over the years. Men who had come to the mountains with hopes of wealth and freedom, only to fall victim to the unforgiving environment. They had all faced their own versions of this storm, whether it was in the form of a brutal winter or a deadly encounter with wildlife. They had all believed they could conquer the wilderness, but the wilderness had always been one step ahead. But Thomas was different. He wasn't just a prospector. He wasn't just a man looking to strike it rich. He was a survivor, and survival was about more than luck or strength. It was about adaptation. It was about learning from your mistakes and finding ways to make the wilderness work for you, not against you. That was what had kept him alive all these years. But now, in the heart of the storm, he felt the weight of his own mortality. He was just one man against an entire mountain, and even he could not stand against its power forever. Yet, in that moment, as he huddled in the cold and waited for the storm to pass, he knew that this was a fight he couldn't afford to lose. The wind continued to howl, its shrill cry reverberating through the tunnel's narrow passage. The storm had intensified, and Thomas was sure he could hear the mountain groaning under the weight of the snow, as if it, too, was struggling to survive. The cold was no longer just uncomfortable, it had become a threat in itself, a relentless force gnawing at his body and soul. His breath came in shallow gasps, the air too thin, too cold to offer any warmth. Thomas hadn't slept in over 2 days. His mind was beginning to feel like a fog, drifting from one thought to the next without any real clarity. He needed sleep, but there was no time for rest, not while the storm raged on outside. There was no guarantee it would let up any time soon, and in the pit of his stomach he knew that he couldn't afford to wait. He had to act. His thoughts drifted back to the cabin he had built months ago. It had been sturdy, well made, but the storm had shown him its limitations. The wind, the cold, it was like nothing he'd ever encountered. He remembered the simple designs of the shelters other men had built over the years, all the various ways they had tried to adapt to this wilderness. Most were too basic, too easy for the elements to break. But he had learned something crucial in the last few days. Survival wasn't about brute force. It wasn't about fighting against the wilderness. It was about finding a way to coexist with it, to understand how it worked, and then using that knowledge to build something stronger. He shifted uncomfortably, his muscles stiff and aching from the hours of immobility. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of knowledge he'd acquired over the years. There had to be a way to make the tunnel safer, warmer, more sustainable. He had always trusted the land to provide, now it was time to push the limits of that trust. There were materials here, in the snow, in the earth, that could help him survive this storm. He just had to use them. The cold was a challenge he could overcome. The hunger gnawing at his stomach was manageable. But the isolation, the complete and utter silence that enveloped him, it was becoming unbearable. There were no sounds of wildlife, no creaking of trees in the distance, no rustling of leaves in the wind. All that existed was the storm and the man trapped beneath it. Thomas rose stiffly, his body protesting the movement, but he couldn't afford to stay still any longer. His legs were stiff, his arms aching from the cold. He crawled toward the edge of the tunnel, where he had left a few of the logs he had gathered earlier. The pieces were heavy, but he needed them. He would make this tunnel stronger, he would make it work. With painstaking care, he began to add the logs to the tunnel's ceiling, reinforcing it against the weight of the snow pressing down from above. It was back-breaking work, but Thomas was used to hard labor. He had been forging his survival in this wilderness for years, and it had taught him one thing above all else. When you think you've reached your limit, you find a way to push further. His mind, sharp as ever, cut through the haze of fatigue, focusing only on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to waste a single moment. As he worked, he thought about the other men, the ones who had failed to survive, the ones whose stubbornness had led them to their deaths. He had seen it before. They hadn't adapted. They had stayed rigid, unyielding in the face of a changing world, but Thomas wasn't like them. He would survive. He had to. Hours passed, and he felt the progress, however small, bring a flicker of hope. The tunnel was slowly becoming more stable. The logs held firm. The temperature inside seemed to rise, however slightly, as the insulation began to take effect. He could feel the fire in his bones now, the warmth slowly seeping back into his muscles. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving forward, enough to keep the storm at bay, if only for a while. The storm had not relented. The snow continued to fall, thick and suffocating, piling higher and higher over the entrance to Thomas's tunnel, but inside, something had shifted. The walls, now reinforced with logs and the crude mixture of clay and earth, had stabilized. The temperature had risen slightly, and while the wind continued to howl outside, Thomas could feel a glimmer of warmth seeping into the tunnel. His efforts were paying off, but he wasn't out of danger yet. He sat down on a small ledge he had carved into the side of the tunnel, the exhaustion catching up with him all at once. His muscles were sore from the constant work, and his body ached from the cold. But there was a fire within him, something that pushed him forward even when his body screamed for rest. He had survived countless challenges before. This one would not be his end. His mind drifted briefly to his past, to the days when life had seemed easier, before the mountains had swallowed up so many men, before he had learned the true meaning of survival. He had grown up in the shadow of Kentucky's rolling hills, where survival was as much about living off the land as it was about making a living. It was a harsh existence, but nothing like this. Nothing like the stark isolation of the mountains, the constant threat of the unknown. But it had all led him here. Here, in the snow-covered wilderness, he found himself testing the limits of his own endurance. His father had taught him well how to build, how to endure. But this was different. This was something far beyond the basic lessons of survival. He wasn't just fighting for food or shelter. He was fighting for his own mind, his own spirit. He could feel it slowly slipping away, but every time he began to falter, he found something new within himself, a piece of him that refused to break. A sound broke his reverie. The wind outside had shifted, the howling noise fading into a low, mournful whistle. He strained his ears, unsure if it was his imagination, but he could hear something else. A soft thud, a scraping sound, followed by the crunch of snow. He stood up, his body stiff and aching, his breath quickening. Was it a bear? A wild animal desperate for shelter? Or was it something else? His heart raced as he crawled to the entrance of the tunnel, his hand clutching his rifle. He knew it could be a dangerous animal, or worse, a man, desperate to survive and willing to take whatever was necessary. But his fear wasn't of the storm anymore. It wasn't the cold or the isolation. It was the unknown, the uncertainty of what lay outside his fragile refuge. His heart thudded in his chest, and for a moment he wondered if this was how all men ended alone, waiting for an end that might never come. The sound grew louder, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Thomas exhaled slowly, his hand still gripping the rifle. The storm outside had shifted again, but whatever it was that had moved toward him had passed. Silence returned, thick and oppressive. He lowered the rifle and returned to his ledge, his mind racing with questions. Whatever had been out there, it had left. And for now, that was enough. He had survived another hour. Another day. He lay back against the cold earth, closing his eyes for the first time in what felt like days. The warmth inside the tunnel wasn't much, but it was enough to carry him through the night. Tomorrow, he would face whatever challenges the storm had in store, but for now, he had found a small piece of peace in the heart of a wilderness that would never truly let him go. The hours turned into days, each one a monotonous blur of cold and silence. Thomas had long since stopped counting the passing time, as the storm had swallowed everything in its wake. The snow had piled higher and higher outside, trapping him in his self-made refuge. His firewood was running low, and the small supplies he had carried with him into the tunnel were nearly exhausted. Every muscle in his body ached, but it was the weariness in his mind that threatened to break him. The isolation was maddening, and every moment of silence felt like an eternity. The absence of sound made the cold more piercing, more tangible. It seeped into his bones, settling there like a curse. The storm, unrelenting and unforgiving, had turned the world outside into an icy wasteland, and within the confines of his tunnel, Thomas felt himself shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller with each passing hour. Yet, somehow, he survived. There was something deep inside him, a primal instinct, that refused to surrender to the cold. His survival wasn't a matter of luck, it was his ability to adapt. His tunnel, though crude, had become a sanctuary, an insulated pocket of warmth in a world of ice. He had dug it with his hands, and now it was his only shield against the wilderness. But as the storm raged on, Thomas's thoughts turned dark. He thought of the men who had come before him, those who had made similar journeys into these mountains and never returned. They had been stronger, more prepared, yet they had still fallen prey to the same cold that gripped him now. The wilderness was a harsh master, and it didn't care who you were or how hard you fought. In the end, survival depended on understanding it, on learning to live within its rules. The wind outside howled, a constant reminder of what awaited him beyond the shelter of the tunnel. He couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, the storm would pass, and when it did, he would have to face the world again. But for now, in this moment of cold isolation, Thomas clung to the belief that survival was still within his grasp. He couldn't afford to let the storm take that from him. Days blended into one another, the cold and silence of the tunnel becoming his entire world. But as the storm began to weaken, something changed. The wind, once deafening and relentless, started to fade. The snowstorm, while still present, no longer howled with the same fury. The mountain was still covered in snow, the wilderness still as hostile as ever, but there was a noticeable shift, a glimmer of hope, faint but undeniable. The small amount of firewood he had left had to be used sparingly, but Thomas wasn't about to let the fire die out. The warmth it provided, even in the small amounts he could afford to stoke, was enough to remind him that survival was possible. His body had grown used to the cold, but he still couldn't shake the chill that ran through his veins, a reminder of how fragile his existence really was. The storm had taken so much from him already: time, warmth, food, and peace of mind, but it hadn't taken his will to survive. It hadn't taken his ability to adapt. He had always been a man who could make do with little, who could turn the harshest conditions to his advantage. And in this moment, as the wind slowed and the snowstorm lost its grip on the mountain, he found himself with a decision to make. The thought of leaving the tunnel, of venturing out into the world once more, was terrifying. The wilderness had claimed so many men before him. It could claim him too, but he couldn't stay in the tunnel forever. He knew that. Thomas crawled to the entrance, pulling back the few remaining logs that had kept the cold at bay. He looked out, squinting through the small opening he had made. The world beyond was still, a blanket of white, but the storm had lifted, leaving behind a hushed stillness. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the sun's faint rays peeked through the cloud cover, casting an eerie glow on the snow-covered earth. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in days, Thomas felt the stirrings of hope. He had survived the worst of it now. He could face whatever came next. The wilderness was still a dangerous place, but it was a place he knew, a place he could fight to survive. With renewed determination, Thomas stood up, pushing the last of the snow from his clothing. The storm had not defeated him. He had adapted, he had endured. And now, the journey was just beginning. The storm was fading, the once furious wind now reduced to a soft whisper. Thomas stood at the mouth of his tunnel, looking out over the barren expanse of snow that stretched endlessly before him. The world was still. No sounds of wildlife, no movement of trees, just the silence of a wilderness recovering from the fury it had unleashed. The mountain had finally calmed, but its lesson had been harsh, its grip unyielding. Thomas had survived, but the cost had been steep. His body was weak from hunger and the cold, his limbs stiff and sore from the unrelenting hours spent in isolation. Yet there was a certain clarity in the stillness of the moment. The storm had passed, and he was still here. He took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp mountain air. The wind had died down, but the chill still clung to the air. His first step out of the tunnel felt like a rebirth, as if he were emerging from the dark depths of a battle, only to face a new challenge. He had survived the storm, but now he faced the reality of the world outside. The wilderness was unforgiving, but it was familiar. He had learned its rules, its rhythms. And in the silence that followed the storm, he knew that he had been tested in ways he hadn't imagined. The snow underfoot crunched softly as he moved, the weight of the storm still apparent in the thick layers of snow that blanketed the land. His path was unclear, the landscape distorted by the whiteout that had kept him trapped for so long. Yet he walked forward, his steps slow but steady. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, and he carried only what was necessary. He had learned that in this world, less was often more. He had no destination in mind, no certainty of what lay ahead, but the wilderness had a way of guiding those who learned its language. Every step he took felt like a small victory, a quiet defiance against the harshness of the world that had nearly claimed him. The cold still cut through him, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It was simply a part of the land he now understood. The quiet was a reprieve, but Thomas knew the wilderness would never stop testing him. He had survived the storm, but now he had to rebuild, to continue forward. With each step, he embraced the truth he had learned in the tunnel. Survival was not about avoiding danger, but about facing it head-on, adapting, and continuing the journey. Days passed in a blur, but the passage of time no longer felt like an enemy. With the storm behind him, Thomas found himself moving with purpose once again, his body growing stronger with each step. The wilderness, once a harsh and unforgiving expanse, now seemed a little less intimidating. He had endured its worst, and though the dangers were ever present, they no longer felt as insurmountable. He spent the following weeks rebuilding his shelter, his supplies, and his confidence. The lessons of the storm were still fresh in his mind, but they no longer filled him with dread. He had learned how to work with the land, how to adapt to its rhythms and its dangers. The cabin he built, though far from the warmth and safety he had hoped for, stood firm against the forces of nature. It was a reminder of his own resilience, his ability to shape the world around him, even when it seemed intent on breaking him. As he worked, Thomas thought about the other men who had come to these mountains, their fates sealed by the wilderness. They had been strong, capable, but they hadn't adapted. They hadn't understood that survival wasn't just about strength or skill. It was about learning to live within the land's rules, to find peace within its chaos. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, Thomas looked out over the mountains. The world had changed, and so had he. He wasn't the same man who had crawled into that tunnel, desperate and broken by the storm. He was something more now, someone who had faced the wilderness and emerged stronger. His legacy wasn't just in the shelter he had built, or the lessons he had learned. It was in the understanding that survival wasn't about conquering the land, it was about living with it. And though the wilderness had never been kind, it had taught him something invaluable. That strength lay not in resisting, but in adapting. Thomas smiled quietly to himself as the wind began to stir once again, a reminder that the wilderness was never truly tamed. But he was ready now. He would face whatever came next, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned how to endure.